start? Hi, I'm Tony Breeden, and welcome to Veggie Man Day. If Gray were here, he would say, welcome to the undercover Air Force agents who are here with us today. Welcome to the space people who look like everyone else. And of course, welcome to the Men in Black who are sitting amongst us. We're going to be showing, later on, we're going to be showing a documentary called Shades of Gray, and they asked me to speak today on why Gray Barker matters. How many of you are familiar with Gray Barker? Raise your hand. Okay, this is good. I did the right presentation, not the one where they know everything. Good. All right, so here's the thing. I didn't know much about Gray Barker either. I started off writing sci-fi. Right now, I do a lot of Fortean books. Who knows what Fortean means? Okay, good. Fortean means that it follows the works of Charles Fort. He originally wrote a lot of these books that were about UFOs and Bigfoot and weird things like frogs falling from the sky. And he wrote a bunch of books about that. And so if you follow that sort of thing, you call yourself Fortean. Okay? Now, my first book was about kids who developed superpowers in a fictional town in West Virginia. But since I had that covered, and it features a flying saucer. There is a flying saucer in the book, no aliens. People would ask me questions about aliens, right? And because I'm a mountain creature, the hair comes away, they would ask me questions. Do aliens have to get saved? Would Jesus have to die on multiple worlds? And they were really concerned about this, and I was smart enough to go, I don't know. So I researched the areas of Christian ufology and what we call exotheology. And that is the theological implications of what if we discovered life on a different planet. How would that affect, in this case, Christianity? Exotheology can apply to any of those religions, like the Muslim religion, anything. So I published a book on it, Strangers and Aliens. I built a website with my ruminations on exotheology, and it turns out we've been asking questions about exotheology since about the Middle Ages. And at one point, I was discussing this earlier, we even thought that there must be aliens everywhere, that life must be everywhere because God's everywhere, right? So that's the sort of thing that we had thinking at that time. Now, while I was researching that stuff, and especially the early days of the flying saucer movement, I ran across this fellow named Gray Barker. Gray Barker was two things. He was an authority on flying saucers. He was West Virginia's chief ufologist. He was also a bit of a prankster, which is the entire reason I have to ask the question of whether Gray Barker matters. Gray was born on May 2nd. That's also my birthday, but clearly he was born several decades removed. He was the youngest child in a very large family in Riffle, West Virginia, which is in Braxton County, which he's very much associated with. And he was one of only two members of his family to graduate from high school. But he was really smart. The New Deal came through West Virginia, piped in sunshine and electricity and opportunities. And that allowed Gray Barker to go to college at Glenville State College during World War II. Barker immediately impressed his classmates with his wit, his humor, and his height. He was 6'4", 6'5", depending on who you asked. He became a prolific member of the theater, but he was really into motion pictures. They were kind of new at the time for West Virginia. He began working at Pictureland theaters and writing film reviews for periodicals like Motion Picture and Box Office magazines, as well as the school paper. And he actually ended up becoming the editor of the Glenville Mercury, which was the school paper. So he was a writer from early on. Now, as far as his sense of humor went, not everybody liked it. There was at least one roommate who requested a different room because he got tired of the pranks, especially the last straw, which was the old bucket of water above the door. Right? So, that's our Gray. Graduation was kind of a letdown. He had studied to be a teacher. And Barker was a teacher at Ellicott City High School in Maryland for about one semester. And he was already making plans to get out by Thanksgiving. He came back home, told everybody he was doing well, but he went back to Pictureland and said, I need a job. And they gave him a job as an audio-visual equipment salesman. Now, this is really funny, though, because in his promotional materials for his books, he would always say, hey, I was a former high school teacher. Or, even better yet, I was the head of the English department, which you can definitely do if you're the only English teacher in the high school, right? So he put his resignation in January, and as it turns out, he made the right decision. Barker got into things there at a very good time. West Virginia's drive-in theater boom was beginning in West Virginia, you know, a decade behind everybody else. That's not a pattern or anything. Anyway, and since there was no one really booking films, he became West Virginia's largest and sometimes only film booker. And he oversaw the construction of movie theaters, and he managed several theaters even up to the end of his life. This particular thing that you're looking at, he wrote into Box Office Magazine to report that the stampede on screen had caused a stampede in real life in the field next to the box office. I'm sorry, it's just funny. Anyway, so Barker appears in early motion picture periodicals, just as news about him, reviews, that sort of thing. For example, here he is in 1949 speculating that he might have just improvised the very first 16mm drive-in when the Board of Education overruled the superintendent his permission to show a nonprofit film at Taylor High School. And so he just set it up in a parking lot nearby and made a drive-in. Unfortunately, Canada beat him to that particular first by 1 year. So he didn't get that particular claim to fame. He wasn't always serious, of course. He came up with a parody version of Box Office Magazine called Hoax Office. And those of you who know Gray Barker, that name Hoax Office might seem kind of significant, but it was just one of those little things that he set up as a joke. It was a promotional thing. DeVry, the maker of the motion picture equipment that he sold, thought it was a great promotional idea. Box Office itself was less than pleased. They said, you need to get a lawyer. And he was forced to retract the parody magazine or face libel charges. Fortunately, he had a lot of people back for him there, and they said, Barker didn't do this maliciously, please let him off the hook, and they did. And you would think that he would learn from that lesson and never do anything like that ever again. Wrong. We'll get to that. Now, that would have been his place in history if it hadn't been for a very peculiar event that happened September 12, 1952. Who here is familiar with the Flatwoods Monster? Good, it's all of you. I don't need to retell the story. Okay, if you really need to see the story, it's in Volume 1 of my Gray Barker's Book of Monsters. Yes, that's a shameless plug. All right, now that happened very near Barker's hometown, in the same county that he was born in. So he contacted Fate Magazine and he said, listen, I can give you the inside scoop here. They made an agreement, and he came to investigate. So, you should know that 1952 was a very good time for flying saucers. There were more UFO sightings than any other year prior, and magazines were actually reporting it kind of favorably as opposed to, panning it like they had in previous years. UFOs had been seen over Washington, D.C. 2 weekends in a row in July 1952 by civilians, military personnel, airline pilots, and even showing up on radar. So people were very interested, and that caused this man, Mr. Albert K. Bender, bow ties are cool, to form the International Flying Saucer Bureau. That was present in all 48 states. That's not a typo. We didn't have Hawaii and Alaska at the time. And different parts of the world. They had about 300 members at one point. And they were, Barker came to Flatwoods thinking that he would uncover a hoax. And he says that in his writings left and right. And what he uncovered was a mystery. These people had kind of the same story. When he separated them, they could draw the same basic images of the monster. And whatever these folk had seen, they'd seen something, and that piqued his interest. So he saw an ad for the International Flying Saucer Bureau in Ray Palmer's Other Worlds magazine, contacted Bender, and Bender made him the West Virginia representative because he didn't have anybody else in West Virginia at that point. That's how that works. But then he was so impressed by Barker's Fate magazine article, The Monster and the Saucer, that he made him the chief investigator for the International Flying Saucer's brand new investigative team, right? They were actually a big deal. Have you ever heard of World Contact Day? Anybody ever heard of that? And there's a couple people in the back, right? And this is where Albert Bender asked everybody in the International Flying Saucer Bureau, through their quarterly magazine, Space Review, we want you to send a telepathic message to the space people. And it started off, calling occupants of interplanetary craft. It was actually so popular that the Carpenters made a hit song out of the very concept at the time. And, you know, they were like, we're friendly, send us a message. And everybody kind of waited around to hear if there was a message. And apparently, Bender had received a message. He'd received an answer. It wasn't the kind of answer they were expecting. It wasn't, right? Oh, my. Right. Now, the October 1953 issue of the International Flying Saucer Bureau's quarterly Space Review posted the following notice. A source which the IFSB considers very reliable has informed us that the investigation of the flying saucer mystery and the solution is approaching final stages. How many times have we heard that line? Anyway, the same source to which we referred data which had come into our possession suggested it was not the proper method and time to publish data in Space Review. The mystery of the flying saucers is no longer a mystery. This is great news. How have we not read about this? The source is already known, but any information about this is being withheld by order from a higher source, ain't it always? We would like to print the full story in Space Review, but because of the nature of the information, we're very sorry. We've been advised in the negative. We advise those engaged in saucer work to please be very cautious. Now, that was unexpected from everyone. The IFSB was going along quite well, membership was growing, and then suddenly this. And you know, Bender got out of the flying saucer business for a decade. He really quit. Now, Bender wouldn't give any details. All he would say is that 3 men wearing dark suits had come and told him to get out of the flying saucer business. Who knows who he's referring to? Men in Black, right? Okay, yeah, so he did mention it to the newspapers. Now, he had said that the reason he was shushed up, that's how they put it back there, was that he knew the secret of the discs. But when they pressed him for an answer to the flying saucer mystery, he would only declare, the truth is fantastic, which was a meaningless thing to say back then. You think, oh, it's fantastic. That means they're from another world. They're from the moon. Well, they could also be from the hollow earth. They could be from a different dimension. They could be, back then, the super high-tech flying saucers being from our military or a foreign government, that was fantastic, for crying out loud. There was really nothing off the table at that point, except the demonic hypothesis of UFO, which didn't come out for another year after that, by the way. In any case, you know, Barker spent the next few years trying to solve the Bender mystery, as he called it, in hopes that it would lead him to an answer to the riddle of flying saucers. And in the meantime, he launched the Saucerian, he later called it the Saucerian Bulletin, and it went on to boast a massive readership because he had all these connections from the International Flying Saucer Bureau from all over the world, and he could pull all the data. He would trade his Saucerian with people from France, with people from New Zealand, from Australia, from Great Britain, from different places in America, and he could get all this stuff in, and of course he had the connections, so he boasted a massive readership almost immediately. And of course, in 1956, he published his most well-known book, basically the preamble, The Men in Black Mystery. They knew too much about flying saucers. And that was the strangest bestseller of 1956. He went on to become one of the most influential figures in ufology, and he was a sought-after speaker, not just from people in ufology, these little book clubs and ladies' organizations and all these Rotary clubs and all these different places would be like, we're going to have the flying saucer guy come here and talk about, you know, the Men in Black. Which is weird. I love it. Anyway, Barker wrote popular columns in UFO magazines. His chief one was called Chasing the Flying Saucers. I love how the little Martian is chasing him as he chases the UFO. That appeared in Ray Palmer's Flying Saucers magazine from 1957 to 1962, and then later in his life from 1978 to 1984 in Timothy Green Beckley's UFO Review. He was the editor and publisher of several UFO periodicals, and again, he sourced his stories from newspapers, both foreign and domestic, other UFO periodicals, personal investigations, correspondence. He was named Ufologist of the Year in 1971 by the National UFO Conference. He created the first Mothman Congress, or Mothman Festival, long before Jeff Walmsley made the Mothman Festival West Virginia's go-to event of dark or paranormal tourism. And by the way, the first person they honored at the Mothman Congress, John Keel, who was none too thrilled with it, because he said this was supposed to be an investigation, not tourism. John Keel. He published a lot of UFO books under his Saucerian Press and then later New Age books. At least 86 that we know of so far. It's 86 and counting. This begins with Howard Minger's From Outer Space to You in 1959, which came along with a nice little record that was supposed to be music from Saturn. That's great. Played by Howard Minger, but don't worry, they taught him how to play it on our pianos. That was cool. Anyway, and then continuing on to lesser known authors like Lobsang Rampa. Who's heard of him? Okay, no, one time. Michael X. Barton. Raise your hand. Okay. Just a couple people, that's right. Timothy Green Beckley. Mr. UFO. Okay, this is a little bit there. And please take note, of course, of Flying Saucers Are Watching You by John C. Sherwood. He comes up here in just a little bit. By the way, that's actually the crew that worked at Saucerian Press over there in the corner. Found that little thing and decided to share it for no reason that has to do with anything here. He officially published somewhere between 13 to 15 books. These are all the covers of the books I could discover. There's supposed to be 2 more out there, and I've yet to be able to confirm that those books actually were published and actually had a book cover that I can find, for crying out loud. If anybody finds, I'll discuss it with me later if you know 2 more other than that. Anyway, and of course you may as well count the Wright Field story, ostensibly by Jim Moseley, but Jim Moseley admitted that Gray Barker was the ghostwriter, and he wrote most of it himself, and that wasn't the only book by someone else that Barker's been accused of writing himself. Of course, I bring up the Wright Field story because it's one of the books where Barker presented the idea that we had crashed saucers and alien bodies at a secret base somewhere. Who's familiar with this concept? It inspired films like Hangar 18 and Independence Day. You might not be aware that Hangar 18 is the first movie that cites Men in Black in its credits. MIB number 1 through 4 specifically. Also, Hangar 18 is a Megadeth song, and those of you who know me know that this aside was just an excuse to get in my Megadeth reference for my presentation. Thank you very much. I love that song. But it's also it's time to bring up the elephant in the living room. And that is that Barker was, to put it lightly, a bit of a trickster. He was a hoaxer. It makes his entire body of work something of a, depending on who you are, something of a question mark or just an automatic stamp of rejection for researchers and archivists and anybody who looks into the stories that he wrote about. John Keel wrote the following in the Illuminate Press version of the Mothman Prophecies. This is the one that came out right before the movie. They issued another one for the movie. Both of these books, the one that came out for the movie and the one that features this lovely art by Frank Frazetta, include a scathing afterword for Gray Barker from John Keel, because John Keel had developed sort of a sore, tender spot about Gray Barker by the time this was written, after Barker's death. He says Barker left behind a rich heritage of practical jokes and UFO hoaxes. He paved the way for the myriad of hoaxes of the 1980s. His Hangar 18 fraud and his Edward Air Force Base fairy tale, in which he named several of his personal friends as witnesses, along with President Eisenhower, and yes, he's talking about Moseley's book, amongst other writings, served as a framework for the MJ-12 Roswell, New Mexico crash saucer hoaxes that absorbed the attention of many UFO buffs throughout the 1980s. The flying saucer cults owed him much. I would argue that it's more than the flying saucer cults that owed Gray Barker. We'll get to that, right? 1957 was a big year for Gray Barker. Yes, that's him cosplaying as an alien. Very proper, really. He attended the World Science Fiction Convention in London, and him and his buddy, Jim Moseley, decided to hoax George Adamski, when once known as the straight letter incident. George Adamski claimed that he'd met a long-haired Venusian named Orthon out of the California desert, and that he had photographic evidence of the alien craft. Now, I'm not just talking about one picture. I'm talking about bunches and bunches and bunches of pictures. Hey, no one else has been able to photograph these alien spacecraft, but I've got a bunch of them here for sale. Isn't that always the way it goes? Right. Now, at one point, Jim and Gray Barker, they were both aware that George Adamski had gotten a letter from the Air Force, which he claimed that was proof of the claims, and that the government knew it. And when actually the letter said the exact opposite, that your claims are false, and we think your UFO things are fake. But he was claiming exactly the opposite. So they knew that if he received a letter, he might trumpet that he had proof of something. So what they did is, one night after heavy drinking, because this is how you come up with stuff like this, Gray Barker and Jim Moseley decided to make use of some official government stationery. Guys, this is a bad idea. Do not do this. It comes with a heavy fine and mandatory jail sentence. Okay? Don't do this. They had acquired it from a friend whose father worked in the State Department, and Barker typed up several different notorious letters, sent them out to the serious ufologists, and also to George Adamski and one of George Adamski's supporters. There was one that was supposed to be sent out to Moseley's dad, who was in the military, and at the last second, Moseley decided, you know what, that's probably not a good idea. I'm not going to mail that one. But see, he got to go somewhere away from Clarksburg. He passed by Washington, D.C. on the way, and he dropped these letters in the mail. And of course, one was written to George Adamski from R.E. Strait, he does not exist, from a department of the government which also does not exist. And of course, it said something basically along the lines of, hey, we're aware of your work, keep up the good work, you're in the right direction. We can't say anything officially. Hey, if you're in town, come and chat us up. Right? That's the long and short of it. It said nothing official. He waved that thing like, proof, I've got proof, I've got proof. Now, Lonzo Dove was a member of the investigative team of the International Flying Saucer Bureau, and he figured out that all of these letters had been typed on Gray Barker's computer, typewriters, because typewriters had little idiosyncrasies where you could tell. It was like a fingerprint for the typewriter. And he worked with Gray Barker, so he knew that was Gray Barker's typewriter. Unfortunately, he sent a scathing investigation, an expose of this to Jim Moseley, who was the editor of his paper. And Jim Moseley was involved, so he just kind of squelched that. Alonzo wasn't done. He went to the FBI. And the FBI did visit Barker, because they weren't concerned with the claims of George Adamski. They were concerned with the possible misuse of government stationery, to like start a war, make the president say something he can't do. Things that AI can do now. Just going to put that out there. Anyway, according to Moseley, after the visit from the FBI, Gray Barker smashed his typewriter to bits and deposited it either in one or several different construction sites in Clarksburg, depending on the version that Moseley told. Lost Creek Circuit. We learned about the Strait letter in 1985, a few weeks after Barker's death. We learned about the Lost Creek saucer film in 1995 when Ralph Kuhn's Gray Barker documentary Whispers from Space came out. We're seeing shades of gray. You are not missing anything. I own a copy of Whispers from Space. It is a tedious, plotting nightmare with bad music. You got the better version. They trust me. There was no reason to ever watch that film unless you're just doing research. It's horrid. Anyway, but it did basically, Moseley needed a hook for his saucer lectures to give him an edge over the other speakers. So they came up with a flying saucer film. Yes, that is a flying saucer model on the end of a fishing pole. Basically, Moseley drove down the road in the truck, Barker had the camera, and their friend John Robinson had the flying saucer out there on the fishing pole. They used forced perspective to make the Lost Creek saucer. And you'll hear about that in that Shades of Gray, but one thing you won't hear is that it was the sales of the stills from that. That's from an ad, paste up of an ad that Gray Barker had. The stills, the sales of just the stills of that, and much less the actual copies of the movie, were so successful, it spawned a sequel, the Benedum Airport saucer film, which was filmed not far from Lost Creek. Isn't it weird? They're all just showing up in Barker's backwoods. John Sherwood, 2 years later and 30 years after Barker published his book, Flying Saucers Are Watching You, he added another layer to Barker's hoaxing, revealing the links of Men in Black myth-making that Gray would resort to publicize the book. And I'm going to let the film tell that one. In 2002, Mosley exposed a few more of Barker's pranks through, this is a very excellent book. I don't know how much of it's true because Mosley wrote it. And mostly, if you notice, all these stories about Gray Barker hoaxing involve Jim Mosley, who was also hoaxing. So, but in any case, it's very entertaining. He exposed a few more of Barker's pranks, such as the Better Book League, and his suspicion that Barker was behind Alexander, a Men in Black character who showed up just in time to help him promote Albert K. Bender's final reveal of what happened to him. Flying Saucers and the Three Men by Saucerian Press, and I'll just give away the ending. You don't mind a spoiler on that really, really old book from 1962? It turns out that the Men in Black were aliens in disguise who were mining an element from our oceans and are based in Antarctica, and the true form of the Men in Black was the Flatwoods Monster. Yeah, nobody believed that book. No one, okay? The Better Book League was Barker's revenge against Laura Mundo. She convinced him to allow him to publish the book without any rights to leasing the copyrights. And then, he was supposed to have sole, you run the books, you're going to have sole, ownership of it. He didn't have it. He just took it on good faith because she was a very popular, very rare female UFO personality. So he did it, and then she published her own version of the book, undercutting his sales and leaving him with no legal recourse. So he wrote a letter to her from the Better Book League that says, hey, the market is glutted with books like this, and it's not a good time for your book. We'd like to pay you several $1,000s to keep it off the market for a few years. Now, if you ever run into that, it's a scam. Now notice that this letter is actually addressed to Mr. Keel, Mr. John Keel. Sure, about 6 months before Barker's death, John Keel received one of these letters from the Better Book League. Yeah, he did that a lot. Anyway, yes, Mothman prophecies. How many of you are aware that Barker had a bunch of phone pranks that he did on John Keel? See, the problem with John Keel is John Keel, he's the author of the Mothman prophecies. Very serious journalistic type of, he described himself as a journalist, not a researcher. Very serious journalistic type of attitude, but he was also very credulous. He was easy to play a prank on him. Gray Barker loved to play a prank. So, in the Mothman prophecies, if you read it, there are a series of phone calls from Mrs. Barker. Come on, Keel. And he wasn't sure who made these calls. He said, well, they discussed, it sounded like you, but it was like a real robotic voice, and he kept getting like Woodrow Derenberger's name wrong. And this, was that you, Gray? Oh no, Mrs. Barker hasn't been making any calls. I called up Ma Bell, and they said, the Bell Telephone Company, and they said that the calls came from your house. Well, that's strange. Isn't that strange? That's really strange. And then just to kind of dig it in, he calls Keel back a couple days later because you know what? I checked, and those calls did come from my house. Isn't that weird? So he writes him a letter here saying, hey, level with me, you fink. Did you make that funny phone call several years back? Or was it somebody imitating your voice? Remember, I sent you a copy of my notes about it. It sounded exactly like you, but uptight. Maybe just plain tight. And if it was a gag, tell me now. So I want to mention it in my new book. He does mention it in the book. He's not really sure whether it's true or not, and he puts it in the Mothman prophecies. It's in there. He eventually figured it out, of course. And of course, Keel also received fake letters from the international bankers, like this one mentioning a Men in Black visit to a young man named Joseph Hensley. This young man allegedly had photographs of UFOs, and the Men in Black came and they stole all the photographs, right? Now, unfortunately, for Barker and Mosley anyway, Keel's interview of the young man and his mother revealed their part in the hoax, that they had actually coached him as to what to say, etc. And I should mention that in Barker's last book, Men in Black, Secret Terror Among Us, that the Hensley Men in Black case, the Baker here from John Sherwood, and the straight letter. They're all in there as unsolved mysteries. You know, people even accused me of writing the straight letter, and that was very painful. I don't know who wrote that. That's really weird. So, yeah, this is the part where they mention Hensley, and that's the part where they, where in his notes he's like, yeah, I interviewed him, and they were coached by Mosley and Barker. This whole thing is a running gag. Now, one of Barker's poems in particular is usually trotted out that Barker didn't really believe in this UFO stuff anyway, and was just out to make a fast buck. Yeah, it's called UFOs, a bucket of change, be nice and clean. Anyway, keep it clean in case some of you guys need to think clean. Anyway, but UFO, that's what he wrote. And a lot of people were like, well, hey, you know, he didn't believe it anyway. Well, at what point in his life? Because like most of us, our views change on things. I used to think the Mothman was a bird, a large bird. Now I think it's a little bit weirder than that. I don't know what it is, but I know that I don't think it's a sandhill crane. Maybe not even an owl. We'll just have to see, right? Now, so what exactly do we do with this claim? Right? There's usually two things that we do. We either ignore the hoaxes, or we say, he hoaxed a whole lot of stuff, therefore everything that is attached to Barker's name must be bunk, right? That's the word that Gray Barker used. It's the bunk, right? I'm going to tell you why Gray Barker matters despite all the hoaxes and pranks, okay? This is something from Gray Barker's, the Gray Barker collection in Clarksburg, West Virginia. And Gray Barker and his friends used to blow off steam by sending these sort of gag or parody things to each other. This is a saucer silencer. You be your own silencer. Be your own Men in Black. Whack them over the head. That does a really good job. Does a better job than the Men in Black, ironically enough. I hate to break it to you, but UFO was a bucket of shaving cream long before Barker ever started stirring the pot. Okay? Before we had Barker, we had Ray Palmer and the Shaver Mystery, introducing a hollow earth and these evil Darrow and their flying saucers. And this was before Kenneth Arnold ever saw a flying saucer in 1947. We had contactees who had regular visits from the space people and received book-length messages from the space people, and even had scads of photographs to sell to you, of course, for $3.95. And they, you know, I mean, these were photographs that were, you know, I imagine J. Jonah Jameson might have paid good money for, maybe not. Which is why Barker had this habit of saying, even of hoaxers and repeat contactees who later embellished their original accounts, he had this saying, it's all part of the pattern. And what that means is that it's our job to sort it out. It's always been a part of the pattern. Now, this is what I did with Gray Barker's Book of Monsters series. I covered all the monsters, aliens, and strange beings that Gray Barker ever wrote about over the course of his career. Because, you know, while for the last 10 years I've been researching his life to write a biography, and you can see how it'd be hard to sort the fact from the fiction in this man's life. So that's why it's taken so long. You know, it doesn't really cover the stuff that he wrote about them so interesting. So I thought, hey, this will be a litmus test to see how much Barker hoaxed, okay? It was the Grafton Monster that gave me the idea to write the Book of Monsters. That's my artwork. I'm sure it doesn't look that toothsome. Basically this was Robert Cockrell wrote a letter to Gray Barker on July 10, 1964, describing his June 16, 1904 encounter with a 9-foot-tall creature with white seal-like skin and no discernible head, which is always Greek to me. And he picked that up in his high beams of his car as he was driving late one night at Riverside Drive. He included 2 newspaper articles about the Grafton Monster from their local paper, describing how several eyewitnesses, at least 20, had seen this monster during their massive teen monster hunting parties that weren't dangerous at all, I'm sure. But it was ultimately discredited, and not for safety reasons, I'm sure. They said that it was a pile of boxes. And the problem was that Robert Cockrell said, yes, that was one of them. There were 20-some sightings. I debunked a few of them, including this one from somebody else that it was a pile of boxes, but that's not what it was. It was a living thing. And Barker was intrigued by that story, and he wrote up a story for a piece on the Long John Neville radio show, which was like the coast-to-coast George Norrie thing of its day. It was huge. But the show was squeezed out by the Republican convention. And Barker only had time to either tell the monster story or promote his books, and he was there to promote his books, so guess what he did? And it's too bad because it was a lost opportunity. It would have blown up, this story. But instead, it was forgotten. Nowadays, the Grafton Monster is pretty famous. It's in the Fallout 76 video game, along with a bunch of other West Virginia cryptids, not Veggie Man, unfortunately. And we have lots of artwork and merchandise, even out there, that's centered around this cryptid, right? We even had the first ever Grafton Monster Festival. I got to speak at that on West Virginia Monsters. Sorry, I just love doing that. Anyway, and today we're having the first ever Veggie Man Day. Because, of course, in the Gray Barker collection, you can find these things. You see, the town that forgot, that remembers so well that it remembers it founded Mother's Day, it forgot about its own monster. Think about that. And he took somebody going to the Gray Barker collection. All those files are correspondence, photographs, letters, newspaper articles, all sorts of stuff in those. And then there's books on the other. And this doesn't even show half of it because most of those shelves have been filled now since then. They had it in boxes that's from my first visit there. And Mark Hall was looking up Bigfoot information, and he discovered this unpublished article in the Gray Barker collection. And that allowed us to rediscover some things. And I thought, well, hey, what other monsters are in there? That's what caused me to write this whole thing to begin with. And of course, like I said, that contains the original drawings. That is the original drawing with the paste stuff that Gray Barker put in for his Gray Barker's newsletter. You can find, stuff just like that. You can see it's still in the form where he pasted it up to later copy it off. It's a great resource. Here's what I've learned from my research. Research, not conjecture, not hand-waving. Research, okay? In researching these monsters, and I mean, so far there's like 60 some. I think we're going to go to volume 5 by the time I'm done, maybe 6. There's a lot of monsters. 85% of the time, Barker just relates the story he received through the newspaper account, UFO periodical, the researcher, his own personal investigations, that sort of thing. He just tells a story. But he's not a journalist. He's telling a story. But he tells the story pretty much exactly how you'd read it in the newspaper. He just makes it more interesting to read. Okay? 10% of the time, he has what we call storyteller errors. That's where you're telling a story and you say Riverside, Michigan instead of Riverside, California. You get like bits of some other story mixed in with this one. You get the date wrong. And in Barker's case, he was a heavy drinker. So sometimes what he typed up might not be exactly as accurate as it could have been had he been sober. Okay? But those aren't purposeful falsehoods. Those are just errors that just kind of slip in. Or like you tell the story that you heard from somebody else, but they've already changed something by mistake. That even happened in Veggie Man's case, where somebody wrote down that there were 25-foot strides instead of the 25-foot leap. That's a whole different thing. You can't play the thesaurus game, people. It's either a stride and it's taking a 25, that's bigger than 7 feet, right? Because it was described as 7 feet. How is it getting a 7-foot stride? Or it's a 7 feet bound. One of the two. And that happened in the Veggie Man's case. 5% are made up out of whole cloth, or they include purposeful fabrications, including just repeating his old hoaxes. And here's the thing. We can research other archives and even the stuff in his archive, and we can find out which is which. In the Gray Barker collection and in his archived writings and recordings online, and frankly in some of the magazines you can find on eBay that I occasionally have to buy to figure out what he said, you'll find a wealth of information on forgotten UFO history, lore, and the development of ideas over time. Things like the Philadelphia experiment, a lot of that comes from Barker. Hangar 18 and crash saucers. There's a Bigfoot file there. There's Men in Black, Hollow Earth, all of these contactees, abductees, past UFO and creature accounts. There's all sorts of stuff in there. You would not believe it. Every time you'll flip through and you'll find something else like, I didn't know you read about this. Sea monsters, a whole file on sea monsters, just for no reason. Love that one. And of course, there are crackpots. He has 5 crackpot files. And I thought, who were the 5 people that he thought were crackpots? Now, can you tell that I'm enjoying this? I really like what I'm doing here. Okay, just to be honest with you. Who were these 5 crackpots? I looked in it, no. He originally had one crackpot file, and he just kept filling it with crackpots. Okay? And then he ran out of room, so he put crackpot file number 2. And he 5 files of crackpots. I am not brave enough to go there. I'll be honest with you, I flipped through it this last visit, last week or so, a couple weeks ago. I looked at it, and I opened the first one and went, nope, too much. I got some actual research to do. Can't do that, sorry. And here's the thing. He kept the crackpot research. Why? Because he didn't know if it was going to be useful at some point. He didn't know if it was going to become part of the pattern. Like it or not, it's undeniable that Barker gave a voice to those who might be otherwise considered fringe, including Jennings Frederick, Vegetable Man's chief witness, only witness, right?
Well, there's been...
Okay, we'll leave that. We got him coming up later. I just want to give him a plug real quick. Okay, and that includes the inconvenient facts of these sightings. Things like Bigfoot sightings that are connected to UFOs. Kill and Barker agreed, despite all of their different disagreements, that even if they didn't personally believe the eyewitness account of the monster sighting or the UFO sighting or the paranormal sighting that they were dealing with, that they deserved to be heard and that those facts needed to be recorded. The raw data is there in those files in the form of clippings, correspondence, interviews, photos. We just need to put it all together. Now, how many of you have seen the first episode of Paranormal Horizons? Another shameless plug. You know why I'm bringing this up, ladies and gentlemen? Because... Sorry, I'm in it. I'm not in the first episode. Anyway.
Is it on Amazon?
It is on Amazon, and it is out available now for everybody. I actually got to watch it last night. It'll be on for everybody at 2 p.m. today, or 2 p.m. tomorrow. If you're a subscriber to Small Town Monsters, you can see it now. Here's what I like about Wild and Weird West Virginia's approach. That's Ron Lanham and Joe Perdue, the Bigfoot researchers. Yep, thank you. Adam, actually back here. Say hi, Adam's actually in it too. I like their approach because they're rediscovering things that we've already discussed. This first episode, I didn't know this was the case. I just knew what I'd been interviewed for. The first episode, they explain what they mean by Bigfoot type A and Bigfoot type B, right? Subject A and subject B. What they describe this as is the typical biological Bigfoot, and the Bigfoot that's associated with high strangeness or UFOs or has something, like radioactivity attached to it or something. It's just something weird. The tracks disappear after a while. There's no good reason for that. In cartoon style. I love those things. Like they just were beamed up. Who knows? Right? And as a Fortean archivist and researcher, I was able to say, hey, I went through the Gray Barker collection, and John Keel was writing about this same thing as unusuals, type A and type B, back in the 60s and 70s. We don't have the whole conversation unless we go back and we research this stuff. See, those reasons bring it up. Now, of course, we also encounter all of the various UFO personalities that were out there. Otis T. Carr. That guy's from West Virginia, and I'd rather not get into it. Jim Mosley, Andy Sinatra, the Mystic Barber, who, in full regalia and a bazooka-like item on his head, went to the United Nations building and saved us all from an invisible attack from Martians. And like Jim Mosley said, it must be true because the United Nations building is still standing. Right? Long John Neville, George Van Tassel, Barbara Hudson. You can name off so many people that are in those collections you've never read about. And their stories are amazing, even when they're not true. Even when you later find out there was a Scooby-Doo moment and they were just trying to make a quick buck. But some of them you look at and you go, oh my goodness, I wonder if that happened. And you know what? That's so much like this other story that's out here. And you can make these connections if you do the research. Now, Gray Barker rubbed elbows with all of them. And he wrote as much about UFO investigators as he did the experiencers and the experiences. Like I said, there's a wealth of history and lore, of ideas and personalities that are contained in the writings of Gray Barker. And yes, it requires research to sort out the hoaxes. Let me tell you the secret. It always has. Gray Barker is no different in this respect. It has always required us to sort out the hoaxes. Things that we think were absolutely, that's what happened. Years later, we can look at it and go, hey, wait a minute. That might be a hoax. or wait a minute, there's some new evidence, something we thought was a hoax, there might be something to this. You have to do real and actual research. A lazy researcher or a skeptic simply looking for an easy way to debunk thing will look at Gray Barker and say, Gray Barker's attached to it, it must be a hoax. They're just looking to confirm their own biases. And frankly, that's wrong. We should be taking the wealth of archival information and carefully scrutinizing that and researching it to find just what's in there. Yeah, we can sort out the fact from the fiction. We're smart people, okay? Monkey bang stick, we've gone way further than that at this point. We can actually look into it, but it's going to require actual work. And I doubt you're going to find a larger treasure trove of UFO and creature sightings anywhere than the writings and recordings of Gray Barker. And that is why Gray Barker matters. We're done. If you want to find out more about exotheology that I mentioned at the beginning, you can visit the website. You can buy my book. It's back there. I do encourage you, if you want to know more about these monsters that I mentioned, pick up a copy of Gray Barker's Book of Monsters. I have 2 volumes out right now. There's 16 monsters in the first one, 14 in the second one. The first one has a Flatwoods monster, Kelly Hopkins, Bill Goblins, that sort of thing. The second has the Grafton monster, and the Bluff Creek Bigfoot. It has 90 pages dedicated to that poor monkey. And I'll be releasing the 3rd volume at the end of the summer. And it includes Mothman, the Wampus Cat, the other Braxton County monsters, and yes, vegetable wings. And I always ask that you sign up for my shamelessly occasional newsletter, because occasionally I do forget about it. That's why it's called that. It's clean and good. And you'll be able to see what I'm up to next. Legend. Maybe, if I remember it. That's it. Yeah, how long is that game? Timer.